Some people can go years without even thinking or talking about it until they hear something like this.
TMZ releasing this tape of Baltimore Ravens player Ray Rice brutally knocking out his then-fiancée Janae Palmer.
A really disturbing thing here happened a couple days ago. Emma Roberts, Julia Roberts' niece, arrested for domestic violence.
And new details regarding Charlie Sheen's domestic violence arrest on Christmas Day.
Others aren't so lucky.
The physical and emotional abuse of a partner, domestic violence, is not something people like to talk about, but today we're talking about it.
I'm Noah Stubbs.
And I'm Zach Evans.
And this is
Canvas.
We're here with Candace Perry. Candace is the executive director for Albion Fellows Bacon Center. Welcome to our program.
Thank you so much.
Now, I did overhear, and I've done some light research about you myself, but you've been with Albion Fellows Bacon Center for over 20 years?
Yes, 23 in fact.
Wow.
Yes.
Can you tell me how you got started and what led you to be where you are now?
Oh, well, certainly. I really did. I started out in our outreach program, and prior to getting hired on, I knew very little about the agency, but did some research whenever I found out that there was opportunity. And the more I learned about the issue of domestic violence, sexual assault, and then that paired up with going in and speaking to the staff, I walked away with my fingers crossed, hoping that I could be a part of this special agency. And so the rest is history. I've spent 23 years working the mission, working with fantastic staff members, board members, community members that really want to see our vision, come to light.
Now, one thing that, and our listeners will hear later in the interview, we did speak with two deputy prosecutors. One thing that stuck out to me in that interview was sort of the cycle of domestic violence. It seems to be a reoccurring thing. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, there is the misconception that domestic violence is primarily the physical abuse, but there is so much more involved. The emotional abuse it's so impacting, and that's how an abusive relationship really begins. It begins with that power and control being exerted on one over the other. The emotional abuse could be isolation, it could be degrading that person, but it's slow in its process. And so in any relationship, you grow with that person, you start to have feelings that grow. And so with the people that we come in contact with, they share that there was this realization down the road once there was feelings involved and investment involved in the relationship. Some of the people that we serve are not physically abused. They're abused in other ways. And
stalking or something along those lines.
Yeah, there is a stalking element to some of these relationships. There are some who will say that they feel like they are emotionally and financially abused. They are controlled in such a manner that they really don't have the independence or the options to go outside of the relationship. There are a lot of limitations and boundaries within the abusive relationship. And again, it's such a slow process and especially if you have grown up in an unhealthy environment or an abusive relationship, you're not going to be seeing the red flags that the people around you are seeing. So you're not identifying it as quickly as maybe someone else would.
That's one thing I did want to touch on. Doing some research just this week about domestic violence, one thing that struck out to me was just being in a family that did have domestic violence issues, and being brought up in that family and not knowing yourself whenever you were an adult that was wrong. Mm-hmm. Could you elaborate a little bit more on that? Is that a huge issue?
It is. It really is. Domestic violence affects 1 in 4 households. Mm-hmm. That's incredible. 1 in 4. And And truly, we all can say that our definition of what is family, what is love, comes from our environment. It comes from those who took care of us as we were growing up. And if you are being raised in an environment where it's volatile, where there's violence, where there's, again, that power and control, then your definition of what is a relationship is all based on that. And from your friends to your family, every bit of that relationship building process is affected.
Albion offers support services to victims of all types of domestic violence, sexual abuse. When victims come to your agency, do you find that they're afraid to talk, as if they're actually doing something wrong?
That's a wonderful question. And yes, there are many people who they'll reach out. They're really unsure. They're testing the waters with us because they don't know if they can trust. There has been perhaps a boundary where they've not been able to reach out to people. And it's scary, that first step, that first call to just explore what your options are. It's very scary. And you question, am I safe in doing this? We work very hard to build a trusting relationship with people that we serve. But we also recognize that first step, that call, that first interview is a huge step for that individual, and there won't be trust from the very beginning. So it's just going to be a process of building with that individual.
Speaking of just the trust and maybe just the hesitancy to walk forward and take that first step, it seems like that's a huge first step for anybody. But one thing, whenever I was reading about this, one thing that it seems like men, whenever they should come forward, or whenever they're being affected by domestic violence, it seems like it's harder for them to make that first step, even harder for them to make that first step.
Absolutely.
Why is that?
Yeah, I think there's such a stigma involved with domestic violence, with abuse in general. Mm-hmm. Our society creates that stigma,
Sure.
and it's handed down generation to generation. And I'll say that we serve men just as we serve women. Every service that we provide is available for a man as well. And we serve on an annual basis anywhere from 6 to 7% of men. And we recognize that is a very difficult step for a man for a lot of different reasons. And so we try to take special care in building that relationship with that individual.
Well, since we're talking about reading, I've been reading on this phrase called gaslighting. Are you familiar with what gaslighting is, Candace?
I'm not sure that I know all the ins and outs of that.
I guess gaslighting is this process of being in a relationship, and it's basically brainwashing your partner into thinking that they're the one that's crazy for, maybe they're questioning abuse.
I hadn't heard it termed that way, but absolutely we hear our clients talk about the brainwashing aspect of it. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was curious how much that plays a factor in some of the cases you've seen or your office has dealt with.
Yeah, the majority of the clients that we work with will talk about how they question themselves because there is almost like a game that's played where, no, that's not my fault, that's your fault. There's victim blaming involved. There's a mind game that takes place, as you're saying. And many of our clients will be questioning themselves. Am I wrong? Did I start this? Is there any way that I played a role in bringing this on to myself? And it has a lot to do with that emotional and verbal abuse, the mind games that you bring up. Many of our clients have not. Well, they are lacking that self-confidence and self-esteem at that point because they've been, broken down a bit. Their self-esteem has been chipped away, and so they're not able to have that balance to see see it for what it is, and that it really is a mind game of such.
Let's talk about the length of the total process from, for me, example, let's say that I was in an abusive relationship, recognizing that I'm in an abusive relationship, and then jump forward to completely just getting away from that situation and just being completely void of that situation. How long generally, I know it's different for everybody, but how long does that take? I would imagine it would be a fairly long process.
Yeah, it is a process. It is not an event.
Yeah.
We say that often to those that we are working with. And you mentioned it. It is very individualized. It's very different for every person. But what we will share with the clients that we serve is that, give yourself time. Know that it's going to take planning. It's going to take building of self.
Yeah.
We want to be able to teach that person, whether it's female or male, how to self-advocate for themselves. So for some, it's a quicker process. If you've lived pretty much in a healthy environment for most of your life, you were raised up in a household that did not have violence, your process is going to be a little bit quicker of a process to get out and to be healed from that. But there again, it's so individualized that it's hard to generalize.
Sure.
Let me ask you a question. Let's say for a future partner of a victim, someone after they've gone through the recovery process, they find someone who's trustworthy, a good person. What advice do you have for that person in dealing with someone who's been emotionally or physically abused in the past?
Wonderful question. I think that there's opportunity to really stress and impress upon the communication that takes place in that relationship. I think that when people are very self-aware, if they've gone through that process of counseling and they've really brought themselves to a point that they're stronger, they're independent, they're sharing that information with their new partner, and also being very vulnerable with that partner to say, here are the areas that I'm still concerned about or I'm still impacted. And having an outlet, a connection with perhaps a support system, so that if that survivor needs to have further care or discussion, that they have that opportunity. And then the partner who is now in this situation, just letting them know that what outlets they have, what resources that they can reach out to is helpful.
What advice do you have for just residents of our community that might not know about domestic violence, but perhaps they're interested in the advocacy? What advice do you have from them? And I'll share an anecdote, because I was reading a lot about this throughout the week, this domestic violence, and I would go to the coffee shop down the street to read about this. And one of my friends came up to me while I was at the coffee shop, and he noticed that I was reading, and he asked me what I was reading, and I said, "Well, I'm reading about domestic violence, actually." And I could see his face kind of change from a smile to just an awkward, uncomfortable, he felt uncomfortable about the situation. And I was a little bit taken back by that, because I was just like, wow, people don't talk about it. What advice do you have for the community to sort of share in advocacy?
Yeah, I'm not surprised that you received that kind of reaction.
Yeah.
It is a hard subject to discuss, but I think that's the key, is getting it out into the open. For so long, it was something that people kept behind closed doors. The response that law enforcement now gives, it's no longer looked at as a household issue.
Sure.
This is a community health issue. And so we need to be discussing how we can change our way of thinking. How do we reverse our thinking about how we treat women, and how are we going to be upstanders, and that's what we call them, instead of bystanders, instead of standing by and letting violence occur. How do each one of us have a role in the prevention of violence? And the key to that is discussing our beliefs and how are we going to change the thinking of our community so that we are standing up.
We had a Pakistani intern at the Courier 2 years ago. It was his first time in the country, I believe. And part of the 2 or 3 week intern process, we sent him on a ride along with a cop. They spent an 8-hour second, third shift with the police officer. And whenever Kashif got back, he talked about how surprised he was at the number of runs for domestic violence. He said the issue isn't like that there in Pakistan, and that he was very surprised to see that that's such a big incident in our city. I don't know if that's just, is that like a regional thing? Is it the city? Is it a big issue in Evansville, or is it just how it is across the country?
From everything that I know through the work that we do throughout our connection with our state coalition and connection with other national agencies, it is a national issue. We know that violence against women in particular is a global issue. Mm-hmm. And it really is looked at and responded to in many different ways in many different cultures, obviously. But there isn't a day that goes by that I don't read an article that involves domestic violence. It is just such a part of our community. And I cannot say that it's unique to Evansville. I think nationally we need to place more focus on the issue.
Do you have any statistics offhand about the number of victims you deal with in say a year?
Well, and I'll start off by saying that every 9 seconds a woman is battered. And what we know and what you've probably learned through talking with the prosecutor's office is very few people will report that, especially the first time that occurs. So we know that it's quite prevalent. The services that we provide at Albion, we have both residential and non-residential. And so when you ask how many people we served last year, in our residential safe shelter, we served almost 800 adults and children in our shelter. So those were people who were not safe in the environments that they were in. But our non-residential served 3 times that number. And our non-residential services are services that we take on the road. We're meeting with people in their own environment, not in their homes, but in safe environments where perhaps this person, they don't need shelter. Shelter's not on their radar yet. They're really trying to explore options. They're trying to put a safety plan together. They're trying to figure out what is the next step. And so our services are meant to help them with that process. And one thing that I would want the community to know is that as I mentioned, we're probably best known as that residential agency, but there's so much more that an individual can gain in our non-residential. We also provide community education and training to different disciplines throughout the community. We're the only rape crisis center in the immediate area as well.
So if someone wants to learn more about your services or request your services, who do they call?
They can call our crisis line. We have 2 crisis lines. I would encourage call 812-422-5622. And we also have a website, www.albionfellowsbacon.org.
And you cut your coverage. Albion Fellows is not just in the Vanderbilt County, Ward County area. It spans multiple counties, doesn't it?
Absolutely. We have 11 counties that we cover.
Okay.
So our footprint starts at Posey County, goes over to the Harrison, Orange, Crawford area up to Pike. But realistically, because of the need that comes to us, we're really able to focus our attention on the Vanderburgh and then the counties that are outlying Vanderburgh most often.
Well, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Candace.
Thank you so much.
So we're sitting here with Javier Lugo and Aaron Schmidt. They are both deputy prosecuting attorneys in the prosecutor's office. Thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, happy to be here.
Thanks for having us.
So, what do you do?
That's a great question. So, as deputy prosecutors, we represent the state of Indiana whenever criminal charges are brought forward. So, basically, if we have a really simple case, John Doe hits Jane Smith, and there's a police report, and there's a decision that charges be brought. It's my job to see that case throughout its pendency. Basically, if we go to trial, I represent the state of Indiana. And if we don't go to trial, maybe there's a plea deal reached. And so our job is to oversee a case from the moment it's charged all the way till its ultimate conclusion.
So breaking this down, what is different between, say, Noah and I getting a fight in this room right now versus, say, a domestic violence incident where it's a husband and wife?
So what's really interesting about domestic violence is something that I think is becoming more well-known, but it's still not as well-known as we would like, and that is battered women syndrome. So there's sort of a cycle that occurs whenever it can be male or female, woman or man, is repeatedly battered. So, and Javier, you might have to help me out here with this, but so initially you have what's called the honeymoon phase. The relationship is great, everything's lovey-dovey, and then there's this tension-building phase. And tension continues to build until you have sort of this explosive incident of violence, and then the cycle starts again. You see that honeymoon phase coming back around. The person might say, "I'm so sorry, I love you, I'll never do this again," and convinces the victim that this person has changed, it's not going to happen again, and then you enter back into that tension building phase, and so that's something that distinguishes these cases, because in order to properly handle them and to really understand what's going on, you have to understand that process.
Now, taking a step back, does domestic violence just limit itself to partnership couples? Does it also include kids or roommates even?
Sure, yeah. And that's a great question. Domestic violence, primarily, as we know, it has to do with folks that are either in a spousal relationship, husband-wife, husband-husband, wife-wife, or if they are living as if they're in a spousal relationship. So basically, if person A is dating person B, right? They're not married. Sometimes if folks just have kids in common and maybe they stay over every single once in a while. And so if there is some sort of relationship, spousal-like relationship, then typically the law treats it as a domestic situation.
So I think what Aaron was getting at is that domestic violence is kind of defined by the repeat offense. How often are there just one-time offenders that you guys see come through the office?
Absolutely. There are everybody every once in a while will have a bad night where there's an argument, and sometimes the police will get called, and that certainly happens. But for the most part, the type of offenses that we most commonly deal with are from the same group of people. We see a high amount of recidivism in certain relationships that for some reason get hostile, get toxic. And for one reason or another, it's very complex, victims of domestic violence will sometimes then go back to the same person who committed this battery, committed this abuse. We could probably talk about why they go back for multiple hours, but to say it's complex is, I'd say, fair.
Sure.
Well, I'm going to throw a Department of Justice statistic out here. Between 2003 and 2012, domestic violence-related crimes accounted for 21% of all violent victimizations. Does that statistic sort of reflect what's going on here locally in our community?
I think that statistic, I think what's happening and what we're seeing is we're seeing an awareness. I think back in the day, this was a type of crime that would happen in a house, and folks would look at the police and say, "Hey, listen, this happened in our house. We'll take care of it." And I think back in the day, authorities would say, "Hey, this happened in this person's house. We're not going to get into it." And so I think that as more high-profile cases come out, as more awareness comes out, I think that we're seeing maybe more charges. We're seeing people take this a lot more seriously. And so I think that's probably leading to a rise in the number of charges. And I can give an example. We all recall the Ray Rice incident from about a year and a half ago to 2 years. I mean, it didn't become real until we saw that video. Until everyone saw that video where they actually saw it happening. It started an uproar. And it started a national conversation. We saw the NBA, the NFL, major pro teams talking out about against it, right? We're seeing the No More campaign. And so again, it's this awareness that's actually starting to happen once we see a lot of these crimes on video.
Aaron, do you mind talking about the protective order process? Who needs a protective order, and when should someone get one?
Sure. So I guess a preliminary question I would have would be, are you referring to civil protective orders or no contact orders, which are actually issued in relation to the criminal cases that we handle?
I guess both. I don't know, or whichever one's more pertinent to the topic at hand.
So I think certainly we're more knowledgeable about no contact orders. So I guess I can elaborate on that first off. Generally what happens is we have a criminal case that's filed. A person will go in on, say, a probable cause hearing where the judge will determine whether there's probable cause to believe that they committed these certain crimes. The next step would be the initial hearing. In both of these instances, a bond will be set for the defendant. It's typically at that time that one of us will request that as a condition of bond, the defendant be ordered not to have contact with the victim. Now, we do this for several reasons. One, obviously, we don't want victims being harassed or pressured in any way by defendants. But also, a lot of times there are defendants and victims who still have this ongoing relationship, and it's good to have this sort of cool down period. Pressure can come in a lot of forms, whether it be pressure masked as loving comments or whether they be outright threats. Generally speaking, we're going to want a no contact order immediately as a condition of bond.
Well, I'm sorry. What if the victim wants to talk to their partner? I guess, is that against the law, or is there any enforcement policy behind that no contact?
So interestingly enough, even if a victim initiates contact, the defendant can still be held in violation of the no contact order. It doesn't matter who initiates the contact. If the defendant is contacting directly or indirectly the victim, it's a violation of the no contact order. Now, what's the remedy for that? Certainly we could have judge, remind the defendant that there's a no contact order in place, but it's also the basis for invasion of privacy charges. Now, invasion of privacy charges, first time offenders, there'll be an A misdemeanor. And then if a person has been convicted of invasion of privacy in the past, then the next time charges are filed, invasion of privacy charges are filed, they will be felony charges.
Okay, going a little bit further into that, let's talk about the consequences of some of these domestic violence-related crimes. And obviously, knowing that there are repeat offenders, is it just like a one and done, you're getting jail time? Or how exactly do you determine what the consequences to those crimes are?
Sure. Any time that there's a criminal charge that's done, the first thing myself, that Aaron Schmidt, and that I think any prosecutor should do is reach out to the victim, right? Hey, let's sit down, let's chat, let's talk about this. Obviously, we'll hear them out, hear what their thoughts are. How scared are they? Has this happened before? And then the second thing I look at is their criminal history. I mean, is this truly somebody who, it's a first-time offense, this was a mistake, they're law-abiding, they have a job? I mean, that's why we're here. We're here to use discretion. We're here to make determinations about how can we prevent future crimes. Mm-hmm. But if our records show us that this is the sixth prior run that police have made out for this, the third prior domestic violence conviction, and they are not law-abiding, just constant problems, which should lead us to believe this isn't going to stop. And at that point, yeah, that's when I'm thinking about making a more stiff offer that probably will include jail time, prison time. But on the other end of the spectrum, if it really is kind of the first-time offense, if after reviewing all the evidence, talking with the victim, there's a determination that yes, something bad happened here, but likely down the future, there may not be problems, and that's absolutely when I'm considering some sort of probation or some sort of work release, some sort of suspended sentence, because at that point, prison time, it may be too harsh.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to ask to follow up. We often hear in our line of work, we often hear about people more recently talking about drug and alcohol addictions and going through the courts, and there's a referral service for that, and I'm sure depending on who you talk to, it seems to be working more so than jail time or what have you. Is there a referral service like a DADS program for offenders?
Absolutely. There are several programs across the state. The one most commonly heard about is the Batterers Intervention Program. It's a certified program where you have to enroll in the program, complete it, go to all the sessions, and primarily they focus on healthy responses to stressors. And that's absolutely an alternative program. I mean, whenever we do look at what sort of offer we're going to make, how are we going to resolve this case, I ask myself, is this likely to stop in the future? And if I can try and make it stop, then sure, I'll offer some sort of suspended sentence. But if there is just a constant repeating, a constant threat, then at that point, my main goal is how can I prevent a future murder? How can I prevent a future catastrophe from happening? Because ultimately, that's our goal. We're trying to protect the public. At that point, I don't really have that much of an option.
Aaron, can you talk about how difficult it could be to get victims to talk about what's going on? I'm sure that they're maybe afraid to talk about what their partner's doing, or if they fear further repercussions. Can you describe that? Absolutely.
So as any of us can imagine, these are very sensitive and, I think Javier said it very well, complex situations. A lot of times we're talking about people's long-term spouses, significant others. I handled a case that this couple had been married for 21 years, and it was still a repeated pattern of violence. So to some extent, this is really, we're sort of delving into these people's personal lives. So it can be very difficult to get them to open up. And as you can imagine, we have cases where, victims don't want to participate in the prosecution of the case. We have cases in which the victims do want to participate. But I think ultimately at the end of the day, we're just trying to reach the victims. And so we try to do everything we can for them, reach out to them, set up a meeting with them, tell them, look, we're here for you. We just kind of want to understand what's going on. We want to know a little bit more about your lives and maybe sort of, what led to this and how we can keep it from happening again.
Is there anything else we should know that goes on in the prosecutor's office for the domestic violence?
That you would like to talk about?
Yeah, anything about the issue that...
As I mentioned before, the awareness, it's coming out. And for the first time, we're seeing, I think, national campaigns that focus on just the right way of treating people, the right way of treating your spouse. And I think it's a healthy conversation. I think all of this being talked about in public, it's healthy. There are some countries, we can probably guess which ones, where it's okay. It's absolutely accepted. It's culturally not a problem if you beat your spouse. And that's not right. No human deserves to be beaten that way. And so like Aaron said, whenever we meet with a victim, we're trying to treat them with dignity, let them know that this isn't right. We're here for you. We understand the psychology behind it, but we hope that one day by working with them, by giving them resources, by showing them victims advocates, that one day they will realize that, hey, I deserve better. I deserve dignity too. And I'm going to move on from this. And so that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to ultimately enforce better accountability just through community outreach.
Well, thank you for joining us. We appreciate it, Javier and Aaron.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you for having us.
Canvas, the Courier and Press's news podcast, is produced by Noah Stubbs and Zach Evans.
Check us out on courierpress.com, the Courier Press app, and podcast apps like iTunes, Pocket Cast, and Stitcher.